Hello and welcome to the lecture on related and unrelated diversification, expanding upon our conversation of corporate level strategy that we started before the exams. A few housekeeping things. As usual, a reminder that Quiz 12 is going to be due April 19th at 5 p.m. We have 3 more quizzes left in the semester. And so what I've done is I've spread the due date out throughout the rest of the semester. So the quiz 13 will be due next Friday, April 26th, and quiz 14 will be due May 3rd. And what I might do is just go ahead and open up all of the quizzes so that you can take them at any point between now and the end of the semester. If you want to go ahead, but I'll leave the due dates when they close as is. Also wanted to thank all of you for that have completed the mid-semester course assessment. It was quite helpful. We got so far I've got about 44 responses, and so if we get 2 more responses, I'll add some extra credit points to your final grade. The biggest complaint with the course was group work, and I think this came primarily from the online section of the course. And you know, I've sensed that group work was going to be a problem for many of y'all, and so I've cut the in-class activities from the course. But you know, it's something that you know is to keep in mind that you know, group work is going to be part of any business activity that you're involved in. Business by its very nature is transactive. It's an exchange between at least 2 people, and so you know, being part of a group, you know, even if you are you know, a sole business owner or work alone, does involve working with other people, and more that work is going to be online in these sorts of virtual groups. So I can understand that there's some frustration, that for many of you this may be the very first time that you've had to work in a group in an online environment. You know, and again, I'm very sympathetic to the challenges of group work. I remember being an undergraduate and remember being an MBA student and the frustrations that I had with group work, but it is a central part of what we're trying to do in preparing you for life in the business world, and that involves working in groups. And some of that group work in real life is going to happen in these virtual communities, or virtual spaces. Yeah, I recognize that that's a struggle, but I'm not sure if that is something that you know, is inherently problematic. I think, you know, maybe what I might do next time I teach this class is structure that a little bit differently. But thank you for your feedback there. The second most common issue that folks shared with me is my grading, and there is you know, it's probably one of the most common themes across all of my student feedback. Is that I grade harshly. I grade higher standards and expectations than other classes. But the interesting thing is you know, my section of a course tends to have a higher grade than other sections of a course. The average tends to be a little bit higher. So I'm not exactly sure what's going on with that or the disconnect there. But it is a very common criticism of folks that they have, but at the end of the semester the grades seem to pan out. And I guess what I'd say is I recognize that there is stress and anxiety about your grade, that you guys put a lot of work and effort into your grades, but I'd say, you know, unless you deviate dramatically from the effort and energy you've put in other courses, I don't suspect that this is a course that's going to bring down your GPA. You know, again, I understand that there is that anxiety, but I want to reassure you that in general, you know, this is not a class that I hope will bring down grades. The third issue that folks brought up was the length of the exam. So I changed that for exam 2, gave you guys a little bit extra time, cut out some of the essay questions, and based on the feedback that I got from the face-to-face class this morning, it seemed that was a good change. The other thing is I've cut the individual case assignment from the class. Y'all have enough work, not only in my class but in everything else, and you guys are getting ready to graduate, and so I wasn't quite sure if the benefits of doing that outweighed some of the cost and pressure that put on you guys. So I've decided to cut the individual case assignment. So with these changes, I've updated the syllabus on As You Learn, so you can kind of see how they break out. And I haven't been able to manage make these changes yet in the grade book, but in the syllabus, there's the new breakdown that you can see. The other change that I want to talk about is case 3. So about a week ago, I returned the grades and my comments from case 2, and it really was mixed results. There were some groups that did really well. There were a couple of groups that got 100% on the case or close to that. And there were a number of other groups that are still struggling, seem to still be missing some of the key aspects that I'm looking for. Some of the things that I've suggested, and so rather than kind of doing the same thing over again, what I want to do is rather than starting a new case, what I've decided to do is if you're happy with your grade on the second case, that is going to be the grade for both your second and third case. If you're unhappy with the grade for your case, for the Skullcandy case, you can resubmit your case for an updated grade, and then that grade will count for case 2 and 3. So case 3 has been cut from the class, and in its place, we're going to have an opportunity to resubmit case 2. If you choose to resubmit your case, you'll need to submit, so you can submit the updated case report, and that will replace the case report grade. And you can also submit updated slides with a recording of your presentation to replace your presentation grade. So if you want to do one or both of these parts, you're welcome to do that. If you do resubmit your case as a group, your group will need to submit a new peer evaluation. So every member of the group will need to submit a peer evaluation for this resubmission of the case. And there is, as I mentioned a number of times in the weeks coming up to the due date of the case, that if you didn't submit an individual peer evaluation, that resulted in losing 10 points on your individual grade. So it was quite significant for those of you that didn't submit a peer evaluation. And then there were some of you who clearly didn't make the sort of contribution that your group felt was valuable. And so those of you who were in that position got a significantly lower grade than the rest of your group. Some of you quite significantly lower. And so for those students who got a lower grade and are unhappy with their grade, the rest of your group may be very happy with the group grade on the case, and so you may have to do a little extra work and a little extra convincing to get the rest of your group to resubmit the case with you. So there's no need to contact me if you plan on resubmitting or not. I'll just set the As You Learn deadline, and for those of you who resubmit, I'll grade those and make an evaluation. In the incredibly low likelihood that your second case or your resubmission grade is lower than your initial grade, I'll just take the higher of the two. So that's the way we'll do that. But there's no need to contact me or let me know. I would, however, for those of you that are planning on resubmitting and have some questions, as always, encourage you to get in touch with me and to go over your case with me. I think that can dramatically improve your final grade for the case assignment. As always, if there are any other housekeeping things or any questions that you might have, please feel free to post your questions on the student question lobby forum, or if you would like to contact me directly via email, we can handle it there. But the semester is quickly coming to a close here, so for many of you, if you're happy with your exam grades for exam 1, exam 2, and if you're happy with your case grades, you just have these few last quizzes to finish up. And like I said, I'm going to open those up probably this afternoon, and so you could essentially be finished with this class as early as this week. But talking about today's class, so we're going to be talking about diversification. And talking about some of the value capture opportunities that diversification provides. We're also going to be talking about related diversification and unrelated diversification and the way that these are similar and dissimilar to each other. And then talk about some of the disadvantages of diversification. What are some of the reasons for which a firm would want to avoid diversifying? We'll talk about some generic modes of diversification. So what are the three kind of generic ways in which firms can diversify? And then we'll finish up talking very briefly about restructuring. So diversification is the process of entering new industries, distinct from a company's core or original industry, to make new kinds of products that can be sold profitably to customers in these new industries. And so firms that do this we call a diversified company. And the real idea between a diversified company and a horizontally or vertically integrated company would be that you're producing products and services that are in distinct industries. So for example, we can think about Apple, that Apple was originally in the personal computer industry, and that they diversified into the smartphone industry, and then diversified further into the tablet industry, and have now diversified even further with the recent announcement into the credit card payment industry. So these are distinct industries or distinct product lines that Apple is in. It's a little bit different than perhaps, say, a company like Adidas, which could be in the sportswear industry. And so while they make football cleats and they make soccer cleats, we would consider that athletic wear. How you draw these boundaries, how you draw these lines are somewhat arbitrary. The initial idea for being a diversified company comes from the United States Chamber of Commerce, and the way that they collect data on businesses is they have different industry codes. And so there's a five-digit industry code, and there's a 7-digit industry code. And so some people consider the 7-digit industry code, if you have different 7-digit industry codes, that you're in different industries. Some if it's in the 5-digit industry code. So it's the specifics are somewhat vague and perhaps unhelpful, but it is somewhat we can think of it as different industries as a way of distinguishing it. And the idea behind diversification is very much centered around this idea that a company or its internal business units are able to perform one of the more value chain functions in these different businesses in such a way that leads to an overall lowering of production costs, increased value creation, or reduction or management of industry rivalries. So these are the same three variables that we've been talking about all semester in terms of increasing the area of the value capture opportunity space. So some of the ways in which diversification the ways in which being active in multiple industries can lead to increased value capture is through transfer of competencies between business units in different industries, leveraging competencies to create business units in new industries, sharing resources between units to realize synergies or economies of scope, use of product bundling, or this utilization of general organizational competencies that increase firm performance. So we'll go through each of these here in a little bit more depth. So if we're talking about transferring competencies, the idea is taking a distinctive competency developed by a business unit in one industry and implanting it in a business unit operating in another industry. And this idea, as most of the diversification discussion we're going to have today, is based on this idea of commonality. And when we say commonality, we mean a skill or a competency that, when shared between two or more business units, allows them to operate more efficiently and create more value for customers. And so this might be, an example would be, a firm having a specific technology. And that they use this technology in the personal computing industry, or to make personal computers, but that same technology is relevant in the smartphone industry. Another example might be a specific expertise in internal combustion, two-stroke internal combustion engine manufacturing. And so that might give you an advantage in the motorcycle manufacturing industry, but it also could be relevant to the lawn care manufacturing industry. So this idea of taking a competency, a unique strategic advantage that you have in one industry, and that same competency or asset is valuable in another industry, and extending it to that new industry. And so it increases value capture in part by lowering the cost structure. So if you're able to extend or spread out the fixed cost of maintaining and supporting a competency over multiple industries, you lower the marginal, or you lower the overhead cost over a larger volume. It enables business units to better differentiate their products. So if you have a particular competitive advantage in one industry, that competitive advantage is relevant to another industry, again, you can differentiate yourself based on that competency. But the key part here is the distinctive competency being transferred has to have strategic value, that the competencies should involve the value chain activities to increase profitability in both of the industries in which you're operating. And so here's an example that I think is somewhat interesting that the textbook chose to use, because there's some ethical questions involved here, but I think the point is valid in that they're looking at Philip Morris, the cigarette company, and in there are a lot of things in the value chain of making cigarettes that are very different than the value chain of brewing beer. But one of the key areas in which they both share is marketing and sales. And both of these are somewhat highly regulated consumer products. There's some negative connotations associated with both. And so the argument that the textbook is making is that the way in which Philip Morris understood how to deal with the regulatory controls, how to deal with marketing, how to get young kids to smoke, are lessons that are relevant and can be applied in the beer industry. That you can use the same kind of marketing tactics to legitimize a stigmatized industry is relevant in both the tobacco and the beer industry. And interestingly enough, I think we've talked about it already this semester, but the tobacco industry has gotten heavily involved in the recreational marijuana industry. And there are a few people that are predicting that many of the strategies that the tobacco companies used in making the science about the health risks of tobacco questionable, and delegitimizing the link between lung cancer and smoking. They're going to use very similar tactics in the recreational marijuana industry. And so there's some interest to see if they do some of the same things, try and delegitimize research that points to some potential health risks and mental health risks associated with marijuana. So we'll have to see, but it's a prime example of transferring a competency from one industry to another industry. And actually, interestingly enough, as many of you who have seen the film Thank You for Smoking, or some of the documentaries on the climate change debate, there's a very interesting kind of circuit that the marketers and the heads of marketing and lobbying for these sort of sin companies, or these bad companies, as we might call them, that these folks go on. And part of the reason that they're able to do that is because of this transferring of competencies. Another idea is this leveraging of competencies. So it's taking a distinctive competency developed by a business unit in one industry and using it to create a new business unit in a different industry. So the prime example of this is Apple with the iPhone. That Apple had a particular competency in understanding how humans interact with computers, and they were able to extend that knowledge to create a new area of the smartphone. It really kind of not invented, but brought the smartphone to the mass market by leveraging their competency in that human-machine interaction. The basis of the model is a company's competitive advantage in one industry being applied to create a differentiation in another industry, or that there's a cost-based competitive advantage for new business units in a different industry. So we might imagine a situation in which a firm has a particular competency in how to handle waste, hazardous waste, and so that allows them to expand in other areas, doing the same sort of waste management type practices, and using that one asset double time. So again, spreading out those fixed costs. That's similar to sharing resources and capabilities, in which you're taking advantage of economies of scope. So the synergies that arise when one or more of a diversified company's business units are able to lower cost or increase differentiation. So when you're more effectively pooling, sharing, and utilizing expensive resources and capabilities, and so the source of the cost reduction is lowering the cost structure. And then also this marketing function creates the differentiation of products, leading to higher return on invested capital. So this idea of being able to use your marketing dollars twice as effectively, can increase the return on invested capital. Now another somewhat different idea of differentiation that I think is pretty fascinating, and something that there's a lot of opportunities that exist, particularly for small and medium-sized businesses, is this product bundling. And it's this idea of providing products that are connected to each other, that these are products and services that go well with each other, that the value of each individual product is enhanced through the consumption of the other product at the same time. And this allows companies to expand their range, providing customers with a complete package. And the goal is bundling products to offer customers lower prices, superior sets of services. And it doesn't always require joint ownership. It can be achieved through market contracts. And there are all sorts of examples of this that exist. And some of these we don't even think about. So, McDonald's is in the business of fast food. They're a food provider, but they also offer beverages. And so again, part of the value in doing that is not just because McDonald's knows that it can make money by selling, that if you're going to buy a burger, you're also going to be thirsty, and so you're going to want something to drink, and so you can make money off of doing that. But as a customer, my experience of going to McDonald's and buying that burger is enhanced because of the presence of a beverage being offered at the same time. So that way I don't have to go to one store and buy my hamburger, another store and buy my French fries, and then a third store to buy my iced tea. I can do it all at the same place, and that makes it a more valuable. Being those items being sold as a bundle is more valuable to me than having to buy them each separately. There are other examples that exist all the time. Loans at car dealerships. So again, if I want to go out and buy a car, it's quite convenient, and it makes a better experience for me as a customer if I can buy my car and get my car loan at the same time that I'm buying my car. And interestingly, the loan at car dealerships. It's an interesting relationship between dealerships and banks because typically the car dealerships are not in the business of lending money, although some do, but most of them go through a bank. But the car dealership fills out all of the paperwork. They have someone on staff that is responsible for managing all of that and has a certain amount of expertise in there. So it's this interesting bundle that exists, and I learned earlier today that for many car dealerships, the financing of cars can be almost as important as the sale of automobiles. That they can get almost as much money through that offering financing as they do through selling cars, which is kind of interesting. Another example is the insurance at retail stores. So one of the few kind of profitable areas for brick and mortar stores has been this offering of insurance on appliance and electronics. So I'm sure any of you who have purchased a washing machine or a dishwasher or a big screen TV, that immediately now when you make those purchases, you're offered an insurance for that. And it's interesting because I'm not sure if it wasn't being offered at the time of purchase if I would ever consider buying insurance for a home appliance. But since it's being offered at the time of purchase, it seems it's a more interesting opportunity, and so it's a way in which firms can expand their area of activity, but by doing so in a way that increases the value for customers. So again, I think this product bundling is a particularly interesting opportunity for small to medium-sized businesses to consider how they can increase profit opportunities. Now, the last of the ways and through which diversification leads to value capture is through general organizational competencies, and this is when when there's the overall management of a corporation, that they can help a company perform at a higher level than it could if it was operated as a separate or independent company, and so it results from the skill of a company's top managers. And so this includes things like entrepreneurial capacity, organizational design capacities, and strategic capabilities. And I think the kind of example to keep in your mind as we go through these is Steve Jobs with Apple. That there was something about Steve Jobs and his management of Apple as a company that really led to Apple being successful in multiple areas. And so there was that supreme management style. And I'm not saying that Steve Jobs is an ideal manager. There are many problems with how Steve Jobs ran Apple. But I think the kind of example in your mind is helpful. Particularly when we're talking about entrepreneurial capabilities. And this is when a firm takes the profits from one area of the company and invests them in a new area to grow the business. And in order to be successful, a company has to have managers that are willing to take risks. You have to give managers the time and resources to pursue novel ideas, not punish managers when new ideas fail, and make sure that the company's free cash flow is not wasted in risky investments that would generate low return on investment. So the prime example here that we can think about, as I just mentioned with Steve Jobs, is that Apple was, when Steve Jobs was there, was a somewhat successful personal computer industry. Steve Jobs had led them to make some significant inroads in the kind of creative industries as well as education. And so what they did is they took some of those profits that they gained from activities in those areas and launched the iPhone. And so it's this idea of kind of expanding and launching a new product based on the ability to see that opportunity. Now the key thing, and we'll talk about this a little bit later when we talk about disadvantages, is that it's very tempting for firms to take their profits and reinvest them in new areas of activity. But firms should do that knowing what they're doing. In that there's some downsides to doing that. The biggest of which is that if you're investing in an activity that has lower returns than other investment opportunities, for example, investing in the stock market, you may be doing your owners or your investors a disservice because while you may be expanding the business, the return on invested capital in the business is lower than other opportunities. So that's the last point there. Capabilities and organizational design, and so this is when managers have created a structure or a culture or control system that motivates and coordinates employees to perform at a high level. And a major factor that influences a company's entrepreneurial capability as well as determines a company's ability to create functional competencies. And so it determines a diversified company's ability to profit from its multi-business model. And the example that I think of when I think about this organizational culture and how that can permeate through all sorts of different industries is a company like Disney. It's absolutely fascinating when you think about the breadth of Disney's activities, the industries that they're involved in. So they're involved in film production, but they're also involved in theme parks. They're involved in not the retail, but the characters and kids' toys. They're involved in television. They're involved in book publishing, sports, so all sorts of different industries. And I would suggest one of the reasons why Disney is able to be successful in all of these different industries is because of the strong focus and attention that Disney places on their culture, and that Disney is known for the culture that they have developed, and that allows them to be successful in many different areas, and allows them to develop the capabilities to be successful in many different industries. And then also there's situations in which what allows a company to be more profitable through diversification is if you have a manager who's particularly talented, and that there's situations in which there are businesses that could be profitable but lack the management in order to be successful. And so these are situations in which a company would be profitable if the companies that are business units that are more profitable because of the top management, the top CEO or top management team than if they were on their own. And that these managers have a specific or a unique ability to diagnose underlying sources of problems of poorly performing business units. And this is really the idea of the turnaround strategy, or the hedge fund management companies that was real big. We talked a lot as a country about these when Mitt Romney was running for president, because his company was a very successful, I don't know if successful is the right word, but his company was heavily involved in these turnaround strategies. And these are, when managers of a diversified company identify inefficient and poorly managed companies in other industries, and they purchase those businesses with the idea of turning them around. And so this is what Mitt Romney's business did. And so some of the ideas behind how you're able to turn around a company Part of it is replacing top management with a new team, selling off expensive and unproductive assets, identifying new opportunity spaces, reorganizing performance metrics and incentives, establishing stretch goals for a firm. The important thing with stretch goals, and if you guys have taken any OB classes or leadership classes, I'm sure you talked about goal theory, and Locke's work on that. And this really interesting idea that human beings have the capacity to perform at higher levels than we think we can, and hence the idea of a stretch goal. But the important thing with a stretch goal is that they only work if it is really reasonable to be able to achieve those stretch goals. And if you have too far of a stretch goal for too long, it can lead to burnout, it can lead to negative culture, it can lead to cheating behaviors. So it's very important to be careful with the new goals, the stretch goals, and make sure that they're reasonable, and that you make sure that employees have access to available resources to achieve those goals. The other thing to keep in mind is the success rate of turnarounds is incredibly low. So it's about 1 in 10 turnaround efforts are remotely successful. And there are a lot of different reasons for this. A big part of it has to do that once a company is in decline, that there are systemic cultural problems that emerge. If you're working for an unsuccessful company, the idea that creates patterns of behavior that become systemic, and those are very difficult to change even when you have new management coming in. And so most of the success of these hedge fund companies is actually not in making the company successful, but it's in liquidating the assets to make as much profit for investors and shareholders as possible. Which I think is problematic and questionable, particularly when it's extended to firms that perhaps are not underperforming, but are performing for long-term value creation, which is where some of the pushback on some of the decisions that Mitt Romney's company was involved in, that they would purchase companies that were profitable, but we're not seeing the sort of double-digit growth rates that some investors had anticipated or were expecting, and so his company would come in and they would liquidate all of the valuable assets of the company, the equipment, the land, any patents that they might have, which generated a great deal of short-term return on invested capital, but pretty much killed any opportunity for that company to move forward, as well as was disastrous for a number of different firm stakeholders, employees of these companies that had worked for the company for 20, 30 years, overnight lost their jobs, suppliers of companies went bankrupt, customers of these companies lost their supplier. So there are some questionable judgments that are made. But I want to switch gears here and talk a little bit about this idea of related and unrelated diversification. And so when we talk about related diversification, it's corporate level strategy based on the goal of establishing a business unit in a new industry related to a company's existing business units. And this is built on the idea that we've talked about by some form of commonality or link between the value chain functions, and is the basis for the multi-business model. It's taking advantage of strong commonalities that can be modified to increase the competitive advantage, allowing a company to use any general organizational competency it possesses in new market spaces. So if you have a competitive advantage in one industry, there's a possibility of extending that competitive advantage into multiple industries. So the interesting thing with related diversification is we traditionally have thought about related diversification as being businesses that were that the end product was similar to each other. So Apple diversifying into smartphones, these are both technology businesses, and so that's a related diversification. John Deere, they make different kinds of combines, and so if they expand into other kinds of farm equipment, that would be a related diversification. Volvo makes, they make trucks, they make big trucks, and they also make construction equipment. So these are both related industries. And what's interesting is that the idea of relatedness has grown quite dramatically, or not grown quite dramatically, but we've become much more creative in our understanding of what relatedness might mean. And so an example would be that we would consider hotel industry to be a very different industry than let's say the weddings industry. These are two different industries, but there's a lot of shared things between these two. And so the idea of a hotel expanding into weddings is perhaps less unrelated as we might think. And so when we talk about unrelated diversification, what we're talking about is corporate level strategy that uses general organizational competencies to increase the performance of all business units. And primarily, these are called conglomerates. And the primary, organizational competency that's used, or organizational asset that's used, is the internal capital market. So this idea that the firm's headquarters can assess the performance of different business units and allocates money across them. So if you have a profitable, business area that's generating cash, and you see an opportunity to expand performance or expand activity in another area, and what's needed is an injection of cash. It used to be that large corporations were one of the few entities in society that could quickly and easily move money from one place to another. And so that allowed them to take advantage of what we call in economics arbitrage opportunities. So these were imperfections in the market, largely the inability to transfer cash quickly and smoothly, or through information asymmetries, that because of my business in the concrete industry, I have particular knowledge about construction equipment industry. So if a lot of orders are coming in for concrete, I know that there's going to be a lot more construction, which means there's going to be more orders for construction equipment. And so that information asymmetry that I have because of my position in the concrete industry allows me to make decisions better than someone outside. But what we see in the modern economy is that those benefits don't really exist anymore, and we've pretty much seen the end of the conglomerate in the modern economy. General Electric is probably the last major conglomerate that exists. There may be some others that are out there, but the ones that do exist, like Disney or Sony, we could argue that they are related diversification, and that it's not, their ability to function is not due to their size necessarily, but because of distinct competencies. And so there really has been kind of an end to the conglomerate in the modern economy, and this idea, because access to capital has increased tremendously. The ability of banks to transfer money has increased dramatically, both because of technological changes as well as the deregulation of the finance industry. We have access to a great deal more information now, and so these information asymmetry opportunities exist less and less. And then we also are in somewhat of a pro-investor culture, and so there are investors that are out there that are willing to take risks and so and those investors are perhaps better suited than the unrelated diversification strategies, because the advantage of the unrelated diversification strategy was access to capital, which doesn't exist anymore. But we'll talk a little bit more about why a firm might get involved in unrelated diversification here in just a second, as we talk about the disadvantages of diversification. So, one of the challenges if you're engaging in a diversification strategy is that the commonality that you're leveraging across industries may be due to specific management, or it may be a technology that you have a particular competitive advantage for. But what happens when that technology becomes obsolete, or what happens when that manager leaves the company? So your company may have a supremely talented director of marketing, and so you can do both consulting. You can do consulting and advertising as your company. And part of the reason that you're able to diversify in these two industries is that you have someone who really understands strategic marketing. Well, what happens when that person leaves and you're in these diversified industries? Similarly with technology, if you have a particularly unique technology that gives you a competitive advantage in multiple industries, but then that technology becomes obsolete, the diversification strategy is less relevant. There's also this, and this is what we were just talking about, the diversification for the wrong reasons. And so, our textbook and most business textbooks tend to be very, very corporate, publicly traded company oriented. And so the lessons that they kind of provide are oriented much more towards managing a publicly traded company. And so if you're in a publicly traded company, one of the benefits of diversification that we know from all of us know from personal finance is that if you're diversified, that you're able to pool your risk and thus reduce your exposure to risk at any one level or any one area. And so there was this idea for a while that a reason why you had these conglomerates emerging, pretty much really starting in the 1960s and then picking up steam in the 1970s, and then quickly and somewhat violently broken apart in the 1980s and 1990s. One of the arguments for pooling risk was that a company that's involved in many different industries, they may suffer in any one industry, but overall they'll continue to do okay. And the argument against this for publicly traded companies is that investors themselves can diversify risk, that rather than the company making decisions to diversify, as an investor I can diversify in multiple companies and not deal with any of the other costs associated with a diversified business. And so that would actually have a higher return on investment than if the company itself diversified. So from a publicly traded company's perspective, the idea of using diversification to reduce risk is problematic. However, we can imagine a number of situations in which an individual company may want to diversify their risk. Particularly the private companies or the non-corporation companies that may have an interest in enhancing their resiliency. So if you're a mom and pop grocery store, and your community depends on your store to give to provide local access to a pharmacy and produce and food, as well as being a community gathering place, the loss of that business can have significant negative consequences to the local economy. And so there may be a valid reason in making that business more resilient. And so, being involved in not just grocery stores, because the grocery store You may have a summer in which produce prices go up, and so the grocery store business doesn't do very well, but you've still got the pharmacy business, so that you can kind of hedge some of your bets that way. And if it's a family-run business, your incentive or your motives are not to have the highest return on invested capital, but to maintain your legacy. And so again, in that situation, you might find that being diversified in undiversified way may be interesting and appealing. The problem, though, that I would say is that it can be quite difficult for an individual business to diversify in an unrelated way enough to make a meaningful difference. And so I'll give an example. I spent my summers going to a summer camp near Brevard, North Carolina, down in Transylvania County. And on Highway 276, there's this gas station. And every summer, I remember as a kid, it seemed that this gas station would add a new area, a new business area. So it started out as a gas station, then they added an ice cream parlor, then they added fish and fishing tackle, then they added tube rentals, and so every summer it was a fun thing to kind of guess what were they going to add next year. And in some ways, it is a smart strategy in that, let's say, one summer there's very little rain, and so all the Davidson River doesn't have enough water to do much tubing in, and so you're not going to be renting a lot of inner tubes that summer. But a hot and dry summer is also a summer in which you're likely to sell a lot more ice cream. And so by being diversified in that way, by having tubes and ice cream, you protect against some risk. However, if the tourism industry as a whole declines, it's likely that all of those businesses are likely to decline. If visitation to Transylvania County by tourists goes down, all of those businesses are going to suffer. And so if you really wanted to diversify your risk, maybe what the business owner should have done is taken the profits from their initial industry, the gas station, and then invested that money into the stock market or another investment strategy in order to really spread out their risk. Again, that being said, there are plenty of reasons why a firm would be involved in unrelated diversification. And this idea that investing in only related industries is relevant to publicly traded companies, but there may be reasons why for private companies or companies with different motives may be involved in it. So there's also bureaucratic costs, and so this is the one of the big reasons why the conglomerates in the 1980s and 1990s were broken up was because there were these activist shareholders that recognized that with these large conglomerates, they had very expensive headquarters. So there's typically, the larger a company, the more you have to pay a CEO. And so you were paying these large salaries for these CEOs of these massive conglomerates when you could have had a far less expensive CEO of individual businesses that were just as profitable as the conglomerate. That the conglomerate in and of itself didn't add any value, but it added overhead expense. And so that was one of the big arguments for the breaking up of the conglomerates in the 1980s and 1990s. And the factors responsible, it's if you've got a number of different business units in a company's portfolio, that requires a certain capacity and knowledge, and there's also coordination that you have to have across these different businesses, and that can be costly to implement. And at a certain point, the coordination costs can become larger than any benefits that could occur. So let's talk about some modes of entering new industries. There's really three kinds that the textbook talks about. There's the internal new ventures, so the transferring resources and creating new business units in a new industry to innovate a new kind of product. Acquisition, the principal way companies enter new industries to pursue vertical integration and diversification. And finally, joint ventures, where two companies agree to pool their resources to create new businesses. And we'll talk as we expand on each of these, but I'll give you a bit of a preview. For me, for the small business owner, small to medium business owner, the joint ventures are where some of the most interesting and exciting opportunities lay. I think the internal new ventures and acquisitions, those are perhaps more relevant for the large corporations that have the kind of resources and capabilities to expand into a new business area or make an expensive purchase. But for a small business, you may be involved in one or two acquisitions over the life of the business, but relatively few acquisitions. The ability to launch a new company, again, is quite small, but there are plenty of opportunities to engage in joint ventures. And I think that's where, again, as a small business owner, where I would be looking for the greatest opportunities. So the internal new venturing, so it's used by companies, you've got technology-based and pursue related diversification, venturing in to enter in a newly emerging industry. So Apple's iPhone is the prototypical example of this. The pitfalls are that market entry on too small of a scale, poor commercialization of the new product venture, poor corporate management of the new venture division. And so a quick story here. So there was some discussion of Lamborghini expanding into the clothing industry. And Lamborghini, when you would buy a Lamborghini, they always give you all sorts of gifts, jackets and shirts and ties and whatnot. And so this idea that Lamborghini could expand into the clothing industry, that they would have a line of clothes that they would sell at stores. But interestingly enough, the problem was that they weren't able to get to sufficient scale in order to make that a viable industry or a viable business activity. Just not enough people knew about Lamborghini as a brand, so there were brand awareness issues. The textbook talks about if you're producing at a smaller scale, you're having to go up against established firms that have far greater economies of scale. So one of the struggles is being of sufficient size to compete in a new industry. So along with that, some of the guidelines for successful internal new venturing, and so we might think about this as what's sometimes called intrapreneurship. So entrepreneurship is an individual firm coming up with a new idea. Intrapreneurship, or the innovative firm, or firms, established firms that develop new products and services. And so how do we have more or less innovative firms? Some of this has to do with understanding and basing new ventures on research and development. So rather than following fads and trends, what is the cutting edge of your research and development, and investing in your research and development. Giving funds to research to business unit managers who can narrow down and then select the best set of research projects. Working with R&D scientists to continually develop and improve the business model and strategies. Fostering links between research and development and marketing to the commercial success of the new product. And fostering links between R&D and manufacturing to ensure cost-effective manufacturing of the product. Taking advantage of economies of scale and scope across functional areas, and finally developing a future product campaign that will build the market presence and brand loyalty quickly. So the second mode in which firms engage in diversification is through acquisition, and it's used by companies to move fast to establish a presence in the industry. And it's less risky than the internal new ventures, It's an easy way to enter an industry that is protected by high barriers to entry. And we've talked a little bit about this when we talked about acquisitions before the exam, that one of the interesting things is sometimes there are assets and capabilities that are so intrinsic that the only way to access them or the only way to acquire them is to purchase the entire team that's involved in it. But some of the pitfalls to acquisitions are integrating the acquired company, and overestimating the economic benefit of an acquisition, and the expense of acquisitions. That sometimes you can get into a situation that if it's found out, if there's a new company that lots of different companies are interested in buying, you can end up in a bidding war in which you have multiple companies driving up the price. And sometimes in that excitement, just in that interest of not missing out on the acquisition, you overvalue the company, which ends up being a waste of resources, because once you've acquired the resource, your ability to leverage that resource to take advantage of opportunities is less than the cost that you paid for it. And that's part of the inadequate pre-acquisition screening. So, the guidelines for successful acquisitions, it's going to start with target identification and pre-acquisition screening based on target's firm's financial position, distinctive competencies and advantages, changing industry boundaries, management capabilities, and corporate culture. So, making sure that you have an acquisition strategy in place that filters out companies with bad culture. So there may be an amazing product, it may be some amazing innovative capability, but it's a toxic culture. And so the likelihood of being able to use that capability in any sort of meaningful way is limited because of the culture. The company might also be in much graver financial strife than you initially think. And so that was one of the big situations during the financial crisis, is that we had a lot of acquisitions of different banks that were doing a lot worse than the company that purchased them initially thought. And what was interesting is when those companies, when the debt of those banks came up, the company that purchased them was on the hook. So making sure you do that due diligence. Another thing to think about is this bidding strategy. So we talked about the hostile takeover, that can drive up prices, making the purchase quite expensive. And so one way to go around that is doing a friendly takeover, in which two companies decide upon an amicable way to merge the two companies, satisfying the needs of each company's stockholders and top management. So rather than doing a hostile takeover, in which it is likely to drive up prices, doing a friendly takeover, in which you have two companies that would be better together, working together as one business, so doing it that way. And then integration. So we've talked about the challenges of integration. It centers upon the source of potential strategic advantage of acquisition, steps to eliminate duplication of facilities and functions, and then learning from experience. And so one of the things that's really interesting is there are some companies that seem to have a particular expertise in acquisitions. So there are these companies that what they're really good at is identifying companies to be acquired, and then allowing those companies to perform quite functionally. So Berkshire Hathaway, the Omaha Sage there, that one of the things that they do incredibly well is identify companies to acquire. And so there's almost this instinct, this acquisition instinct, that seems to emerge from these sorts of businesses. And they develop a playbook. They have a way in which they do the acquisition, that they handle the transition, and it becomes almost instinctual. And it's situations in which those instincts and habits and routines can be particularly effective, especially in terms of doing it quickly. Because one of the challenges of an acquisition is you have this period of ambiguity and lack of clarity, and the longer people are in that space, the more difficult or unsettled they can become. And so one of the important things during an acquisition is the quick transition to this new leadership. And by having a playbook, by having a routine set in place based on experience, you can make that transition quicker rather than having to think through every decision that you make. And so the last of the three types that we're going to talk about here are joint ventures, and we've talked a lot about joint ventures already this semester. And so the idea of a joint venture allowing a company to share in the risks and costs is something that we've already talked about. And the downside is the lack of benefit. That you have to share whatever profits are there, and there's also problems if you have differentiation in skill or capabilities. The partner with superior skills may end up not gaining as much of a percentage as the smaller partner. And then there's also different business models or time horizons that can lead to conflict about how to run a joint venture. And so the example that I thought about was a luxury hotel that offers it has a joint venture with a rock climbing guide, and so the luxury hotel, they don't do the rock climbing, but they offer they advertise it as a service to their guests. They can it can be billed to their room and added to their invoice. The rock climbing guide meets the clients in the hotel. They've got a room in the hotel where the rock climbing guide can keep his equipment and park his van. And so it could be this great joint partnership between a rock climbing guide and the hotel. But the rock climbing guide, if there's a thunderstorm coming through, he or she is more likely to cancel the trip, because the values in the rock climbing, the mountaineering industry, is customer safety. That's a primary value of that industry, and so the threat of a thunderstorm is sufficient enough to cancel a trip. But the luxury hotel, their primary value is customer service. And so there may be a situation in which the climbing guide would like to cancel the trip, but the hotel would take that risk because they don't want to disappoint the client. And so you can run into a situation where you have that tension, and how you handle that tension can be difficult when you've got these joint ventures. But I would say that the joint venture, as I mentioned earlier, is really an interesting opportunity space, and it's a way to grow in industries in which there's really not a lot of growth opportunities, because it allows you to leverage expertise and competency in complementary and in bundled sorts of ways. So we just talked about hotel and traveler services with the rock climbing guide. There's another interesting story. The Dutch dairy industry, which is quite large, one of the challenges that they have is because of the waste from the cows is a real problem, and it causes a lot of water pollution problems. And so for many of these dairy farmers, they spend a lot of money cleaning up the waste. Well, there was a fertilizer company that kind of recognized that farmers were having to pay to get their cow manure collected and transported, and was taken to a landfill. And these fertilizer companies said, hey, we can use that manure. So what ended up happening is you had this joint cooperation in which the dairy farmers had their manure, which they previously had to pay to be removed for free. And then you had this fertilizer company that was able to get a feedstock for their fertilizer at no cost. So it was an interesting opportunity in which you have these complementary businesses that interestingly enough, nobody had thought about everyone was scratching, all the dairy farmers were scratching their heads saying, how are we going to get rid of this waste? It's so expensive to deal with. And they were fighting the environmental regulations, and then this fertilizer company comes around and says, hey, we'll take your manure for free and solve the problem. So the point is there are a lot of these opportunities that are not major opportunities. They're not industry disrupting opportunities that exist, but there are these marginal opportunities that, again, for small and medium-sized businesses can be quite meaningful and can be quite impactful and sufficiently large enough to make a living doing. Another example are breweries and food trucks. So we talked about these bundled services. This idea of food trucks and breweries and tap rooms combining and joining forces. There are a lot of people in the Asheville area, and here in Boone, the food trucks showing up at the breweries, that they make a living, out of this synergistic opportunity space that exists when you have these complementary services. So the last topic that I want to talk about is restructuring. And this is the reorganizing and divesting business units and exiting of industries. And firms engage in this to refocus on a company's core business and rebuild its distinctive competencies. The reasons for it, investors feel that these companies no longer have multi-business models. So the commonality that once existed or maybe never existed is seen as no longer valuable. The complexity of financial statements of highly diversified enterprises disguises the performance of individual business units. You've got trying to understand the intricacies of how these assets are shared can make it difficult to understand how any individual business is performing. The response to declining financial performance brought about by over-diversification. So we talked about the overhead costs, in the top end costs that diversified firms have, as well as the organizing and management costs. And then the diminished advantage of vertical integration or diversification from innovations in strategic management. So it may just be that over time those keen CEOs retire, and so your ability to benefit from that leadership in multiple industries also declines. So there's an interesting debate or narrative that's going on with GE. So GE was, like I've mentioned, is one of the few conglomerates that's left. GE is a poorly performing firm, not only just compared to GE's standards, but compared to the S&P 500, it's underperforming. And so there's been some questions if the reason why GE has been unsuccessful when it was once the most successful and largest American corporation was because of Jack Welch retiring from General Electric. And so his retirement meant the loss of that leadership. And so it's no longer able to be profitable in these multiple divisions. My feeling is in fact the opposite, is that it's in part because of Jack Welch's short-term focus that GE has lost its ability to function effectively. That Jack Welch sold a lot of productive but expensive assets in order to bolster short-term earnings. He also heavily oriented the firm towards financialization. That GE Capital, the finance division of GE, is now larger than all other divisions combined, which made it particularly vulnerable to the 2008 financial crisis, of which it has never recovered. And so, there are situations, there are ways in which you can imagine that many of the different divisions of General Electric have complementary, have commonality and could benefit from synergistic opportunities. That research and development in wind turbines also can lead to innovations in home appliances. And so having these cross-functional knowledge could be helpful, but because of the way Jack Welch operated, it created a culture in which that sort of cooperation ceased to exist, in which there's no longer synergistic opportunities. So an interesting thing to think about. I don't know if my analysis is 100% or even close to the ballpark, but I think it's interesting to think about. So that's it for today's lecture. We'll have one more lecture this week, and until then, thank you all very much.